Welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event on behalf of the Nashoons Project Consortium. My name is Isabel Kutcher. I'm a senior project manager with the European Network of Living Labs, one of the partners on the Nashoons project. And for today's event, it is one of the many sessions that we are organizing as a project consortium. And it's part of the preparatory steps to support the implementation of the EU mission, A Soil Deal for Europe, 100 living labs and lighthouses to lead the transition towards healthy soils by 2030. And to give you a little bit more information about what we're up to, so this month and next in April, the Nashoons partners are delivering similar events in 43 countries, so member states and associated countries, so quite an ambitious delivery of activities on our side. And we're also organizing a range of different side events at different stages to facilitate networking within and across countries, and of course, between stakeholders of various land uses, professions, and to facilitate the application process for the EU's Living Lab calls that we'll be talking about more today. So with that, let me go over to the next slide here, if I'm able to. There you go. So we have a really great program scheduled for you today. You will, of course, hear from us, the Nashoons Project, we'll provide an overview of the soil mission. We'll talk about what living labs and lighthouses are, how living labs can help achieve healthy soils, and we'll also talk about the key points of the this year's open calls. We also have a great local expert joining us today to present the regional context, Dr. Karen Daly, who is a senior research officer in environmental science at TISGASC, and I hope I pronounced that okay, in the Crops, Environment, and Land Use program. So thank you very much for joining us. And really our aim for today is that by the end of this event, that you really see Living Labs as the way forward to lead a transition towards healthy soils, and you're inspired to co-lead and co-create, participate in soil-focused living labs, and of course, submitting an application to the open calls. So let me switch over here. A few housekeeping items before we get started. So we will be sharing the participants list of everyone who registered for today's events with this group, so that it will only include the names and institutions and email addresses. And this is to facilitate networking within this group so that you're able to connect, although I suspect and I believe that you already know each other quite well, but we'll be sharing the information so you're able to continue conversations following up this event. We will maybe take some photos of the screen as we go on, just to capture a few moments. So that might be a potential thing that we'll be doing on our side. If you have any issues with you being shown in the pictures, do please reach out to me. And I also have my colleague, Delinda, on the line. So feel free to get in touch with us if you would like not to be shown in any of the pictures or materials that we're using from today's event. If you have given consent during the registration process to receive updates either from the Nashoons project or for other soil mission related initiatives, you of course always have the right to withdraw your consent, and you can do so by email by contacting the info@nashoons.eu. And finally, this is a hybrid event, so we have many of us joining us online today, but we also have a room of people, so great to see everybody joining us. It's lovely, and we'll be recording today's event so that it can be shared after the fact for anyone who might not be able to make it today. So we're making sure to record the event for everyone. And with that, then I would like to pass it on to Dr. Walsh, Head of Division, Research Food and Codex Coordinator, to provide some welcome remarks. So over to you. And maybe I'll stop sharing for a moment here.
Thanks, Isabel. Thanks for that. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Yeah, perfect. So just to welcome everyone to today's event. It's doubling up as the second meeting of our National Mirror Group for the Soil Mission, along with being this dedicated event focusing on living labs and lighthouses. So we're co-hosting it effectively with Nashoons and Enol. Just to cover off some of the housekeeping for the Mirror Group, I do have a number of apologies, but really glad to say we've got I think a good attendance at today's meeting. So I want to thank everyone for making the effort to participate. Just for people that don't know, and in case you didn't get to read some of the blurb around the agenda, Nashoons is a Horizon funded project, and I mean, it's essentially helping regions and authorities and organizations like ourselves to apply to the core topics in the mission, particularly on living labs for soil health, and it's part of the European Network of Living Labs, or ENOL. This, I think, is one of the key topics in the 9 areas that are in the 2023 soil mission call. That call has a budget of over 126 million, which is, I think, double what it was in the first call in 2021. And within that, 36 million is assigned to the living labs topic. And we've heard a good bit about this before, and at our previous meeting, it's a challenging one for us to get our heads around. So we felt that having this co-hosted event with Nashoons and Enol today might help to clarify some issues and advance our thinking on how Ireland could engage with the living labs topic. So they're just some opening comments from me. I'm going to stop talking because there's a busy agenda there. I'll hand back to Isabel. Looking forward to the presentations. And I'll come in at the end with some AOB items that relate to the Mirror Group itself.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'll be sharing my screen here in a moment. But a big thank you to the Departments of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, of course, for hosting today's event and for all your support and the organization of the event. So we very much appreciate the good collaboration here. So let me then reshare my screen here. Here you go. It should come through momentarily. Okay, wonderful. So let's go into the first presentation of today, which aims to give you an overview of course, the soil mission. I suspect, yes, some of you, of course, will be familiar with this content, but we'll use this as a refresher for everyone. So the EU has launched the mission, A Soil Deal for Europe, to provide the gradual creation, of course, of the 100 living labs and lighthouses in Europe, and to lead the transition towards healthy soils by 2030. Having 2030 as a timeline for the soil mission is a key stepping stone to achieving longer term political targets set under the Green Deal, such as, of course, healthy status of all soils by 2050. And we will get to the living labs and lighthouses in a bit. But first, we can use this presentation to remind ourselves of the importance to promote healthy soils. And as we are, I'm sure, all convinced of this already, life on Earth depends on healthy soils. Soil is the basis of 95% of our food, not to forget, of course, all the timber that we harvest and use. Healthy soils provide essential ecosystem services such as clean water and habitats for biodiversity. There are also major carbon reservoirs that help slow climate change and make us more resilient to extreme climatic events. So really, healthy soils are crucial for all life-sustaining processes on Earth, but yet soil is often taken for granted. Soil is a fragile, non-renewable resource that needs to be carefully managed and kept safe for future generations. And soil is threatened globally because of a range of human activities, such as competition for land, intensive land use, production, consumption patterns, urbanization, and more. In Europe alone, about 2/3 of the soils are considered to be unhealthy. And that number does not even include an uncertain percentage of unhealthy soils that is due to poorly quantified pollution issues. So that number could be even greater. And degraded soils, you lose their capacity to act as carbon stores. They lose their capacity to filter and store contaminants, releasing pollutants that can end up in the groundwater or even enter the food chain and pose a threat to our global food safety. The process of soil degradation can lead to a collapse of landscapes and ecosystems, making societies more vulnerable to extreme weather events, food insecurity, contamination, and political instability. And you'll see on this slide here that we lose quite a bit when it comes to soil health, since the cost associated with soil degradation in the EU exceeds 50 billion of euros per year. So recognizing the importance of soils and the pressure that soil functions are under, the EU made soil the focus of one of its 5 missions, which we'll see here. But the EU missions are a new way to bring concrete solutions to great challenges. And the soil mission is created to lead the transition again towards healthy soils by 2030. There you go. And the soil mission is organized around 8 objectives, which are shown here. So just going through them very quickly: reducing desertification, conserving and increasing soil organic carbon stocks, stopping soil sealing and increasing reuse of urban soils, reducing soil pollution and enhancing restoration, preventing erosion, improving soil structure to enhance soil biodiversity, reducing the EU global footprint on soils, and improving soil literacy in society. So the living labs and lighthouses that will be created do not need to focus, of course, on all 8 objectives, but they are likely to address multiple of them. Soil mission projects might cover, in fact, several soil health challenges or themes, mission objectives at the same time, and they might also even have different living labs across different land users working on these common challenges. But it's just an important point to make, that we are not asking the living labs and the lighthouses to cover all 8 objectives. It's very much dependent on the particular living lab that is being created and the project that is the cluster project that will be put forward in the applications. So just to give you an example, in an urban perspective, projects that could focus, say, on increasing urban green areas through the paving and the sealing would be seen, for example, to cover soil objective number 3 on the reuse of urban soils, number 6 on soil structure and biodiversity, and even 8, for example, on soil literacy. So it's implicit that projects will cover several objectives. And the mission is aiming again to create 100 living labs and lighthouses across all land uses and throughout Europe. So living labs and lighthouses will accelerate the co-creation and uptake of solutions to meet specific objectives, to tackle specific soil issues. And soil health can be improved in many places. The mission does not distinguish between the types of land use. Instead, it addresses all the different land-based systems. So again, that's agriculture, forestry, natural areas, urban, and post-industrial. So we're really looking at the full range of land uses. And the mission encourages strong stakeholder and citizen engagement to accelerate the co-creation and uptake of solutions. And looking at, there you go, perfect. And of course, here we're looking at a successful mission requires a co-implementation by a wide range of stakeholders, so land managers, regions, businesses, researchers, policymakers, citizens. And we'll talk more about the different types of stakeholders that should be engaged in the living labs and in the projects. But to give you an idea, that we're really looking at boosting open science and a participatory innovation through engaging a wide range of stakeholders. There you go. So the mission is made out of 4 building blocks, which each address a hurdle to overcome. So the first quadrant here on the research and innovation program, which really builds is aiming to build a knowledge base for soil health and its support to ecosystem services to overcome the knowledge gaps. So to really fill the knowledge gaps and perhaps mend the access to data and knowledge. We also have, of course, the living labs and lighthouses that are meant to accelerate the creation and uptake of solution. We will have the soil monitoring framework at the EU level and at the member state level as well to track the process of the soil mission objectives, which again addresses the lack currently in capacities for monitoring soil health. And finally, we have the last building block on soil literacy, communication, and citizen engagement that addresses the perhaps lack of awareness and know-how on soil health related topics and matters. So these 4 blocks together are very much needed to foster the transition towards healthy soils as part of the mission. And this slide here is used to show that living labs and lighthouses are truly meant to be, and they are the core elements of the mission, and that they benefit from and contribute to all the operational objectives in the missions. So living labs and lighthouses add to the research and innovation program, like I said before. So we have all the different components here. And of course, living labs and lighthouses are ideal places for citizen engagement, for activities to take place in real life settings, and looking at other ways to fill existing gaps into the soil health system. Okay, so we will, of course, hear from Dr. Daly, our local expert, again, about regional soil needs in a moment. But we did want to present here the activities that are being organized under a sister project of Neshoons called Prep Soil, which is meant to be the preparatory step again to the soil mission, where it's just where we're developing a lot of the understanding around soil health. So developing a definition for what would be a soil health living lab and looking at different regional needs. So Prep Soil is currently has identified soil needs in 21 representative regions across Europe, which we can provide more information, but you can also find more information online. And the important bit from this slide is that the soil needs and drivers for change that will be synthesized across the 21 regions will really include the different land uses anywhere on the spectrum between the different types of land uses that I mentioned before. So here you have the urban, industrial, agriculture, nature, and forest. But we understand that these are there is gray or areas between these land types, and it needs to be represented. So you see on this graph that there's already been thinking behind this and mapping the different types of land uses, even though for ourselves and organizing the mission, we might be referring to buckets of land or more generic terms for land uses, but we're still keeping in mind the fact that there exists in-betweens when it comes to these various land types. And here, there has been a comparable study within a project in a European joint program, which SOIL, which you might be familiar with, to identify the regional soil needs for the agricultural sector alone. So this is purely focused on agricultural land use. And the figure that is shown here shows a summary of the survey that's been completed among researchers and stakeholders. And what we see is that some of the challenges are present in almost every country. And for example, you have the soil health challenges that you can see here and how they're represented in the different regions. But it was used as also as a reminder that even though many regions might be sharing the similar soil needs, the underlying problems to these needs might be completely different depending on the region. And there are differences in soil needs that can be due to many reasons. For example, differences in soil types, climate management, or even political and social conditions. So just some good context to keep in mind, and to then also provide a bit of an introduction to the next presentation here. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Karen Daly for a presentation on the regional soil needs. And Karen, I will have your slides here, so you can certainly let me know once you want to advance the slide, and I'll move them for you. So over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Isabel. That was a very interesting overview of your project and the soil mission. And so, like you've mentioned, I'm going to talk about the sort of national perspective, so where we've come from and where we are now in terms of soil health. And for anyone who I haven't met in the group, my name is Karen Daly. I work at Johnstown Castle. So you can move on to the next slide, Isabel. And I work with Teagasc, which is, for the overseas visitors who may not know us, but we're the Irish Agriculture and Food Authority. We have about over 60 locations around the country, and have 3 pillars to the organisation. There's research, advisory and education. Next slide, please. And our research centre is located in the southeast of the country in Wexford. That's the Environment, Soils and Land Use Department, which comes under the Crops, Environment and Land Use Programme at Teagasc. So we're a knowledge-based organisation, and so I'm coming from a research background into the organisation. So next slide, please. So this is the team in Johnstown Castle. Some of them are on the group, on this mirror group. Some of them are well known to most of you here, but just we all work across different thematic areas in the department at Teagasc, but soil health does cut across a lot of what we do. Everything from greenhouse gas emissions to biodiversity and agroecology, and the bioeconomy and the reuse of bio-based fertilizers and recycling of waste streams into soils for fertilizers. Our land use and land use change modelling relies a lot on soil information and soil health, and our water quality as well. Our water quality programme relies on the information that we have on soils to develop the models that predict out water quality forecasts. So next slide, please. So today I'm just going to give a very high level overview to the group on how we see soil health and how it fits into our soilscapes, some of our past policies and the future policy landscape, some of the soil functions that we're interested in, and challenges and opportunities. Next slide. So, as I mentioned, we're based in Johnstown Castle in the southeast, but we have a long history and a rich tradition of developing soil information that dates right back to the 1940s and 1950s, when we set about developing our soil information and soil mapping. And that continued right into the 90s with the development of the soil information system. So there's been a lot of different iterations of how we view soil, how we've mapped soil, and how we have described soils in Ireland. Next slide, please. But the rationale for a lot of that information came from the production potential. So because we are an agriculturally focused organisation, and agri-food is our main focus, the rationale for looking at soils, for mapping them, for characterising them, for describing them, was always built around their production potential. So a lot of the legacy publications and documents that the organisation and we produced as a country were largely around describing soils in that context. And a lot of that information is still very relevant today as we try and get a handle on the diversity and the range of organic and mineral soils around the country for carbon sequestration. Next slide, please. So in terms of how soils in Ireland have developed, there's always been an interaction between climate and topography, parent material and soil biota, and over time, soil forming factors have created the mosaic of Irish soils in our landscape. So we have a very heterogeneous landscape of soils in Ireland. Next slide, please. And so when you combine them all, we've ended up with 11 great soil groups, over 200 soil associations, and even more soil series. So we have a very complex pattern of soils in Ireland, which makes it difficult to produce soil type specific management, advice, or to be able to scale up or scale down when we're doing research or providing advice on soils to practitioners. And of course, the main challenge now lies around separating out their mineral and drained organic soils in terms of their carbon sequestration and carbon storage potential and the emissions, so that while our mineral grasslands might be able to sequester 2 megatons of carbon dioxide equivalents, the drained organics are emitting a lot more. So the real challenge is around trying to identify those and trying to remediate that and mitigate against it. Next slide, please. So local weather patterns in Ireland play a huge role in how we manage soils and how we see soil health. We often have high rainfall patterns on the western seaboard, and that has definitely dictated how agriculture has developed on that side of the country and compared to the eastern parts of the country. But it has also informed soil formation. So many of our peat soils and our organic soils are on the western seaboard and midland areas, and that's largely due to the combination of climate and soils. So next slide, please. So we've always tried to think of soils about, in terms of giving a response to agronomy. So in the early days, we talked about the production potential of soils, but it's the environmental responses now that we're interested in as well. So trying to combine the agronomic and environmental responses and trying to get a handle on how that varies from soil type to soil type at multiple scales, everything from small field scale, managing environmental responses and agronomic responses at field and farm scale, right up to catchment scale in terms of modelling for water quality or modelling for climate or greenhouse gas emissions, and up to national scale for putting information into national inventories. So soils have always played a huge role in the environmental responses that they give based on the weather and management. Next slide, please. And of course, management has an impact on soil health. So this is a slide from one of our boards. If some of you may have been at our Soil Health Open Day last week. So soil compaction in terms of tillage systems is an issue, and so there's definitely a soil health consideration there. So that's one of the threats that we're looking at. Next slide, please. So in terms of soil health today, how we define it, and Isabel alluded to it there in her talk about soil health being about the capacity of soils to function as a living ecosystem, to sustain plant and animal humans, and that's very true. So this is how we have to look at it now in today's context. Next slide, please. And the soil functions that go with that. So we're primarily, from an agricultural or agri-food perspective, primarily interested in primary productivity, nutrient cycling, carbon storage, and water quality, how it filters nutrients, how it filters contaminants, and soil as a habitat in terms of how it provides below ground biodiversity and how it can mitigate as well as greenhouse gas emissions and sequester carbon. So they're the many soil functions that are very relevant in Ireland for Irish soils. Next slide, please. And so again, it's just reiterating the same thing. The EU soil strategy definition does speak to many of the functions that we're very interested in Ireland for Irish soils: biomass production, storage and filtration of water, provision of habitats, and acting as a carbon sink to store and capture carbon. Next slide, please. But one of the many challenges we face is to build sustainable food systems. So it starts with the soil and goes right through to the entire food system, right to the end. And that relies on building resilience in our soils and protecting our soil health. Next slide, please. So many of the functions that we need to protect, or many of the functions that we're interested in that speak to soil health, are quite mechanistic. So there is a deep understanding needed in the mechanisms of carbon capture, in soil's ability to regulate acidity, in nutrient cycling and nutrient turnover, providing nutrients for plant uptake, and many of the other functions that I spoke about earlier. So at smaller scales, the information gets more complex, and understanding the mechanisms behind the functions becomes very important as you try and find ways of enhancing those functions and protecting soil health. Next slide, please. But coming back to our diverse array of soils in Ireland, are over 200 soil associations, and the sort of heterogeneous nature of Irish soils and landscapes, we do have to consider the different soil types bring to those mechanisms. So in terms of our capacity to sequester carbon, we have to think about the soil type as well as the mechanistic part. So we have to think about the small scale and the larger scale. So the spatial extent of those soils in terms of the influence of soil texture and particle size. Peat soils, clay soils, and sandy soils will all have a different capacity to sequester soil carbon. And so how they occur and where they occur in the landscape, the extent of them also feeds into our ability to capture that, and understanding the dynamics behind that in terms of what are the different soil attributes that play into carbon sequestration. So it's a bit of an understanding or trade-off, I suppose, between the small scale mechanistic understanding and then extrapolating up to wider scales, whether it's catchment or regional scale, and on into national scale for national inventory reporting. Next slide, please. And so back to carbon again, the main challenge for Irish soils is carbon capture and reducing the intensity of drained organic soils to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So trying to slow down the mineralization and reduce emissions, and reaching our land use change targets to increase the carbon sinks in Ireland by 2030. Next slide, please. And I suppose what we can do, some of the actions we can take to try and mitigate against losing soil health or damaging soil health. And again, this comes, but some people may have seen this from our open day last week, but is to increase above ground biodiversity. So above ground diversity enhances below ground diversity. So when we think of perennial ryegrass, we might think about multi-species sward. So the more diverse systems you have on top, the more diverse microbial communities and structures you have below ground. So the microbial communities can be associated with the different plant species there. Next slide, please. And so this brings me to the multi-species swards work that's happening in Teagasc, and how there are many co-benefits to having above ground diversity, not just from the reduced emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, but it improves soil structure and improves soil water infiltration. So it does speak to a lot of the functions in soils and enhances them. So this is work that is ongoing in Johnstown Castle in Teagasc. Next slide, please. And I suppose one of the developments we've progressed with over the years is visual assessment tools. So while some of the mechanistic work might be difficult to capture at practitioner level or at larger scales or roll out to wider audiences, we can certainly look at visual assessment tools to be able to assess soil health. And so previous versions of this would have looked at visual assessment tools for looking at soil compaction and being able to roll out a sort of a decision support tool for farm extensionists and advisors that could be used as teaching material or demonstration material, or showing practitioners how to identify compaction and how to maybe mitigate against this. And again, we have something similar here for soil health. So it's the more visual assessment tools you have available, the wider awareness and demonstration of soil health you can bring to the wider farming community. Next slide, please. So in terms of the policy landscape, Isabel outlined quite eloquently there what the policy landscape for soil is in terms of the EU landscape, but I'll move on to the next slide because it might just, I don't want to repeat what's been said earlier. And so I suppose what we're thinking about at a national level here in Ireland is how the soil health law might impact us as a country and impact our Irish soils. And one of the features of that might be monitoring and assessment. And if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So we're always trying to look for ways to measure and assess soils, whether that's, with either remote techniques or laboratory-based techniques or field techniques or visual assessment techniques. It's always good to have an array of different ways of monitoring and measuring soil attributes or soil indicators so that they can be managed. So next slide, please. And one of the challenges, I suppose, is the fact that we have to think about how we are going to monitor and assess and manage an array of attributes, physical, chemical and biological, that all interact with each other across time and space. So the spatial scale at which you monitor and assess and understand has a huge bearing on how you can roll out management options and mitigate or protect soil health. So and then of course there's the temporal dimension as well. So a lot of the indicators of soil health will be very dynamic and may be very sensitive to changes in management or sensitive to changes in land use. So it's how we think about these going forward in terms of building monitoring and assessment networks to address soil health, but also to address the soil health law and other policy instruments. So next slide, please. So some of the attributes and indicators, and this is just a subset of a list of things that we typically will go after or measure to try and get a handle on soil health. Soil attributes, we put them in this box because they speak to more static attributes that will tell us a little bit about the nature of the soil or the character of the soil, how it might be characterized or classified. But on the other side, on the right-hand side, there are more dynamic attributes that may change, maybe quite sensitive to different changes in management, and much more variable and vary depending on their landscape position, vary depending on their management and land use. Next slide, please. So in terms of indicators of soil health for Irish soils, we need to think about what we want our soils to do. So we need to link our indicators to soil functions. What are the functions that we're primarily interested in? And what are the main indicators that we can identify that speak to those functions? Understanding the mechanistic nature of those functions is very important, because that mechanism will change depending on the soil type and depending on where that soil is situated in the landscape, and any other factors that influence the mechanism in terms of its land use and the soil management. Indicators that are sensitive, so a lot of the biological indicators and some chemical indicators can change with time. They can have a seasonal dependence, and they can be sensitive to changes in management practice. So how are we going to think about bringing them into a monitoring and assessment network, or reporting these to the Commission for Soil Health Law? How do we develop a framework for monitoring and managing those? So I guess the biological indicators are the ones that pop up as the indicators that will need a temporal framework, because they're likely to be more temporally variable and more sensitive. And then we have to think about the units of scale. When we think about soil health, are we going to monitor what's our unit of scale for monitoring? What's our unit of scale for managing? So we typically manage at farm scale, and we might report at national scale. So how do we come to a compromise, or how do we find a good monitoring network or unit of monitoring that can address both? Next slide, please. So these are just some of the thoughts that we've had in Teagasc in our department when we've been discussing soil health, and talking about how we will think about it going forward. But there's definitely some of those challenges that are identified could also be opportunities. If we can address most of those challenges, we'll definitely build resilience into soils and improve farm sustainability and for more sustainable food systems. And hopefully in time we'll have more tools to measure and monitor. So whether that's starting with the visual assessment tools or going right through to understanding a little bit more in depth about the mechanisms behind some of the soil functions. And in total, it should lead to better protection for soil health, because the more knowledge we have and the more tools we have available, that's ultimately the end game. Next slide, please. So just to acknowledge some of the group who contributed to the material in the presentation and who are part of the department working on soils. Some of them, like I said, are probably on this call, and some of them are in the group. So it's a collective effort from our department. Next slide, please. And just thank you for listening. Yeah, and there's my contact details if anybody wishes to get in touch with us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Daly. Really appreciate the really interesting presentation on the regional context. Always interesting to see, now that this is our second national engagement event, it's interesting to already see the differences between different countries and different regions. So thank you so much for the time, for sharing your time with us today.
You're welcome.
So for everyone, what I would propose is I have about 15 more minutes of presenting, and then perhaps after that we can ask everyone to hold on to their questions just a little bit longer if you have any questions for Dr. Daly or for me, and we'll try to make some time here for questions. And anyone online, if you have any questions, you can start popping them in the chat box as well. Always welcome to do that. Okay, so perfect. So before we move into understanding the 2023 open calls and the thematic focus, we thought we would give a bit of a presentation on what is a soil health living lab and lighthouse. So moving on to the next slide here, soil health living labs and soil health living labs are, of course, collaborative initiatives to co-create knowledge and innovations. So just reading from the slide here, they are defined as user-centered, place-based, and transdisciplinary research and innovation ecosystems, which involve land managers, scientists, and other relevant partners in systemic research and co-design, testing, monitoring, and evaluation of solutions in real-life settings to improve their effectiveness for soil health and accelerate adoption. And meanwhile, soil health lighthouses, they are defined as places for demonstration of solutions, training, communications that are exemplary in their performance in terms of soil health improvements. So it's important to remember that soil health lighthouses are really local sites. So one farm, one forest exploitation site, one industrial site. That's one way to think about it. And another way to visualize the soil health living labs, which are place-based again and are collaborative between different most stakeholders and partners at a regional and sub-regional level to coordinate experiments on several sites. So you see here on the left that lighthouses can be one of the many experimentation sites of the living lab, or they can be of course, valuable high performance site that is outside of the living lab. So both options. And then the table on the right here just recaps really nicely this information to provide more the compare and contrast on the scale, activities, and performance and soil health improvement of the different types. And as I've referred to before, an essential characteristic of the living lab methodology is the user-centric approach, which really puts at the middle, the center, this end users, and that addresses and includes all actors across the different sectors of society. So the quadruple helix model, which we're showing here on this slide, is an extension of the typical public-private partnership. So now we are talking about public-private people partnership. So the PPP and the different sections or parts of this model includes academia. So for example, universities or research centers. We have the public, we have the government. So government and regional development agencies, for example, that would include policymakers or even the public sector as a whole. We have industry, which can consist of businesses of any size and business associations as well. And finally, the fourth actor in the quadruple helix being the citizens and civil society. So that includes all end users, for example, consumers and their associations. And on this slide here, you will see that, of course, the mission implementation plan defines a set of criteria for the selection and setup of living labs in the context of the soil mission. So the criteria are classified across different 4 main areas: aims, activities, participants, and context. So this is really a guide to look at the criteria of when your checklist, really, when you're doing when you're creating a living lab. So in the aims, we're looking at innovation, co-creation, formal learning. So just briefly reading from the slide, improving soil health and related ecosystem. In the activities, the required activities include co-creation, co-development, experimentation, networking, knowledge exchange, demonstration, and again, in particular, in lighthouses. For participants, we're looking to include the public-private people partnership, real users, and again, doing demonstration. And for the context, refers to the inclusion of multiple disciplines, methods, dimensions, again, the importance of place-based and having real-life context included, and a robust scientific setup for ecosystem assessments. And for lighthouses, in parallel, the criteria is based on exemplary performance and potential of inspiration within soil health and related ecosystem services. So now that I've covered a little bit more the what is a living lab, let's take a look at what are the benefits of living labs and why we should be using this particular approach. Living labs have been more and more recognized as an important tool to tackle societal problems. They help address, of course, complex challenges that cannot be solved by single stakeholders, and by involving citizens and end users from the very first moment. Living labs not only support the the rapid scale up of innovations, but they will also help better achieve broader social acceptance. And here on the sides, you have other benefits. So of course, you have overcoming the lack of trust between stakeholders, finding common ground between different actors that have different approaches, but they would share similar goals, and evaluating, validating, and uptaking of practical solutions from users that maybe perhaps would not be easily reachable typically. And here, I'm just step one more, perfect. So Living Labs focus on joint value co-creation, rapid prototyping and testing, scaling up of innovations and businesses. So we are always talking about products and services within the open innovation ecosystem. Living Labs use an iterative feedback process for quick prototyping, testing, so that processes and project results can really quickly enter the market. And again, here you will see some other benefits when cooperating in a multi-stakeholder team will make you become more inspired, think out of the box, aim again for the same goals, and while having different perspectives and quickly finding solutions that have been thoroughly evaluated from different perspectives and are therefore can be scaled more easily. Here you go. And what to consider when setting up a living lab. The main components that you can see here need to be walked through multiple times with the core stakeholder and the living lab team to initially agree on a strategy as well as operational and business plans. There are many tools that have been developed to facilitate this process, and we're happy to be providing more information on these processes in the upcoming capacity building webinars that the Neshoons project will be hosting. So do please make sure to keep an eye on our website and subscribe to our newsletter so you can hear about these in the upcoming weeks. But to give you an overview of what we have here, so of course, a living lab environment should have a good relation with and access to users willing to be involved in the innovation process. A living lab should also have access to multi-contextual environments as well as high-end technology and infrastructure that can support both processes of user involvement, but also technology development and tests. Each living lab environment needs organization and methodologies that are suitable to its specific circumstances. And finally, living labs need access to a diversity of expertise in terms of a wide range of partners. So again, referring back to the quadruple helix that can contribute to the activities of the living labs. And yeah, I think that's it for this one here. So just tapping through here, following the soil mission, Neshoons consider 4 main types of soil health living labs. We have agricultural, urban, forestry, and industrial living labs. And here on this slide, you will see what is the focus and the key players for each type. And going over to the next slide here, again, referencing to the different types of living labs and different land uses. Again, referring to this project, the sister project, Prep Soil, that I referenced to earlier. Prep Soil has been developing a map of soil health initiatives across Europe. And this map is heavily, has been so far been feeding from the previous soil mission support project under Horizon 2020. So we've transferred some of this information over, but now we're expanding this map. So we're adding more and more initiatives. There is also a form on the website where we're encouraging living labs and lighthouses, other types of initiatives to reach out and self-identify so that we can add them to this map. And this is truly to be used as a resource to make connections, to find potential partners or different stakeholders that are working on the same issues or land use types as you are. So we strongly encourage you to make good use of this resource. We are adding more and more initiatives to this map on a regular basis. It can be found on the prepsoil.eu website or at the link on the screen. One note to make is that as we know, Soil Health Living Labs will be funded later on as part of the mission. So we do not have soil health funded through the mission Living Labs just yet. So just to keep in mind that what the initiatives that you will find on this map may not all follow the criteria set through the mission. So that's just a bit of a caveat and disclaimer that right now we're adding initiatives to the map, but they might not all follow the soil mission criteria. So to keep in mind. And the next few slides will provide, we wanted to give still a few examples of successful living labs in the various land use types. Many of them are actually certified living labs as part of the ENOL network. So we start here, I'll just quickly go through them, but there'll be more for reference later. So here we have precision agriculture for all through the Biosense Institute, which is the first living lab in Serbia and one of the first in Europe to focus on precision agriculture. Next here, we have OMKI, an agroecology-focused participatory experimentation network in Hungary that aims to promote agroecological transition. Then we have, sorry about that. We have the Poland-based Krakow Technology Park, the most complete one-stop shop for business operating in the country. And they have a portfolio of initiatives that includes several green projects. So another good one to check out. Torino City Lab, which is an initiative aimed at creating more accessible conditions for companies and other interested parties to respond to concrete needs of the territory, public administration, and its citizens. And finally, we have here the Save Our Soil for Life, a demonstration project that aims to contribute to the implementation on a municipal scale of European guidelines on soil protection and urban regeneration. Some great examples of work that is underway and ongoing. And finally, the last bit of my main presentation today. So we'll take a look at the two calls that will be open for proposals later this year for funding living labs under the soil mission. A simple disclaimer that Neshoons as a project, we're here to provide general information on the calls and reflect the information given by the European Union as well as possible. But we do want to note that the sole official source of reference shall remain the 2023 mission work program that's been published on the European Commission website. So here you have the two calls that we are as a project focusing on. So we have the soil health call 0108 on co-creating solutions for soil health in living labs, and the call 0109 on carbon farming in living labs. The deadline for application will be the 20th of September at 5 p.m. Brussels time. To note that this is a single stage submission, so meaning that the full proposal must be submitted all at once by the deadline. And it has to be done through the funding and tenders portal electronically, so no paper submissions are possible. And it is a research and innovation action, and which is great since it means that any actor is covered by 100% funding. And as always, as we're talking about the actors to be involved, to always keep in mind the quadruple helix model and involving the variety of stakeholders. Another very important requirement of the calls is that 4 to 5, these will be the projects to be submitted will really be clusters of living labs. So each application should include 4 to 5 or more living labs for each application in at least 3 different member states and or associated countries. And to see this a bit differently, so we've referred before to the 8 mission objectives. So really looking at all of them, except for number 2, that's really under the 0108 call. And because the carbon farming call 0109 is focused on carbon farming, if you're looking to address number 2, the soil mission objective number 2 on conserving and increasing soil organic carbon stocks, that one would definitely fall under the carbon farming call. But any other objectives that you think would be covered under your project or your living labs would fall under the 0108. So it's a bit it is broader in this sense. For the call on soil health for living labs, we are looking at, there's a 36 million euros funding envelope for this particular call, and they are expecting at this time for 3 projects to be funded. While for the carbon farming call, there is a 12 million euro funding envelope, and they are expecting to fund 1 application. And okay, that's it for me. So let's open it up to any questions. We have a bit of time. I think we have a few minutes before we wanted to take some time for engagement as part of today's event. So feel free to, I'll maybe stop sharing my screen for a moment here so it's easier. I don't see any questions yet in the chat, but feel free to come on the line, raise your hand, or put your question in the chat. We're here to answer your questions. And one thing I will mention, and I'll refer to this as well in the conclusion of today's event, is that while, again, we are here to support and provide information, we may not have all this is our 2nd national engagement event, and we're still gathering a lot of questions from the different stakeholders. So this does mean that we might not have all the answers to your questions, but we do commit to seeking answers to every question. And we're compiling an FAQ, essentially, that we'll be putting on the website. So any question that we might not be able to answer today, we'll take back with us and we'll seek answers for you. But please feel free to jump on with any questions. Can institutions from the UK be partners? Yes. So the latest information, and I don't want to misspeak, but from my perspective and what I do remember is that they were eligible as a third-party country, I believe, perhaps. But yes, they were eligible. But I can seek the actual official answer to this. But the short answer is that yes, you can participate. I guess my presentations were really thorough. If we have any questions, if nothing comes to mind now, yes.
Yeah, I might just ask a quick question. So you mentioned that there are 4 types or 4 areas: the agriculture, urban, forestry, and industrial. So do you think that the Commission would have a desire to have the 3 living labs projects that are funded spread across those areas, or how do you feel they would show preference there? And from your engagement so far, do you think most interest will be in applications to towards the agricultural theme, or do you think it could be spread over those 4 areas?
That's a really good question. And unfortunately, the short answer is that we don't know just yet what will be I can perhaps give you a sense of what we've heard so far. From the official information we've received is that the living labs and the cluster projects can address 1 land use or several. So it's really the on purpose made it open the door wide open. So it's really, there's no limitation when it comes to the land use or the objectives that I've mentioned before, is that you can cover several as needed. And there is no indication that there would be an official preference for a certain type of project. What we've heard, however, is that there needs to, as part of the 100 living labs that will be created and funded through the soil mission, is that they are looking to have living labs in all the different regions. So that's something to keep in mind in terms of geographic reach of your project, is that that's something that we've heard that is mentioned in the soil mission implementation plan, but not in the work programs. So something to just keep in the back of your mind for this.
Okay, thanks. And just while we're unmuted here, probably useful to point out as well that I think New Zealand have association status now, so they could be a country that people should keep in mind, given the similarity in agricultural systems.
Thank you for this. Yes, great comment. Mr. Hughes, I think you have your hand raised.
Thank you, Isabel, and thank you, Karen. So my name's Ian Hughes. I'm working with the Department of Further and Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Science. So I'm working more on the sort of overview of all 5 missions, if you like. So we're listening in on the different working groups and the different sort of activities across the 5 missions. And I'd like to congratulate you, because both of you, this is what you've said is really understandable. Yeah. So often in the missions, some of the missions are taking different approaches, and some they're also being sort of rolled out as they're being developed. So, but I think what you have both explained this morning is really clear. What my comment, I've a few questions, but I'll just have one. I'll just ask the first one here. I think the distinction that you've made, Isabel, it's the first time that I've heard this distinction, where you would have, and I think the terminology is problematic in terms of understanding what is going on. So as you've explained it, lighthouses are single projects, single sites maybe, so they're almost like potentially transformative projects, The living labs are networks of those lighthouses. So the living labs are actually learning or potentially transformational ecosystems. They're not actually physical labs. So the terminology, I think, can be problematic. If my understanding is correct. And then what Horizon Europe is trying to do is to bring together those ecosystems within individual member states to really create international scale for addressing the problems. So the calls are really for member states to engage in this. There's almost a requirement or a necessity for those individual elements of the individual sites or projects, the ecosystems that are already nascent or beginning to be put together, in order for each member state then to put those elements together in the calls for this international level of scale. So could I check with you if that understanding is correct? And then just, as I say, if it is correct, then I think the terminology is difficult to understand and maybe misleading.
Thank you for this. And we've heard similar, and this is where it's important to use the same language, because it can be easy to have a certain level of uncertainty when we're looking at the living lab and lighthouse. So to re-specify, the lighthouses are exemplary, I always have a hard time saying that word, exemplary sites. So the experimentation sites. So as part of the living lab, you may have several experimentation sites. They might not all be lighthouses. Only the very, very top of the line best practices ones will be considered lighthouses. And then in addition to your experimentation sites, you're also looking to have other types of stakeholders as being part of the living lab, and that's again referring to the quadruple helix with the different sectors of society. So we're really looking at having all these different stakeholders involved in the living lab. And it does need to be place-based. It's an important requirement and the part of the definition of a living lab that it is place-based. It's in real life context, context. So we're not looking for specifically for online necessarily only, and it wouldn't be applicable, say, in the soil ecosystem, but for other types of thematics or areas, that's something that we need to often re-emphasize, is the importance for place-based living labs, and for that component. In terms of the member states aspect and how we want to engage them, what we've heard and maybe what we've wanted to reiterate is, because the call is open to fund a certain amount of projects, is what we're encouraging the different member state countries and associated countries is to work together within their own ecosystem as well. Is that what we suspect is that they want to see a lot of collaboration, not competition, within the different member states, so that you can organize yourselves to create a living lab, so that you can really pool your resources and impact. So I don't know if I hope I answer your question.
Yeah, I guess one other thing just to point to make on the term living lab, yeah, it's very scientific, yeah. So when it comes to the participation of other stakeholders, for example, on citizen engagement and so on, it sets up a certain type of engagement, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
And in terms for transformation, it's not only science that needs to be involved, yeah? So it's also, you know, it just strikes me as the term being, from that perspective, too, a little bit problematic. Yeah?
Thank you for this. And I'm happy to report that, as I referenced, and I'll mention it again in the conclusion, is that we are developing a series of webinars that will dive much deeper in the concept of living lab, because we knew that as part of these national engagement events, they're quick, they're an introduction to different things, and we knew that time would be limited. So we will be using upcoming webinars and presentations to address more of these questions and dive deeper in the different concepts around living labs and methodologies. So stay tuned for those for sure that are upcoming. Looking at time, just because we again wanted to reserve a little bit of time for engagement, since you've heard lots from us, and now we want to hear from you. But if you have any more questions, again, feel free to send them over to us. There'll be our contact information at the end of today's event, so you can always reach out to us or on the website for nishoons.eu. But for now, I will just reshare my screen here. What we have planned for you is to, yes, do a bit of an engagement session for the next, very short, so 25 minutes or so. Let me switch over to the next slide here, if I can. Let's see. There you go. Okay, perfect. So I had put 30 minutes, but I think considering time, we'll do about 25. So we'll return at, let's see here, local time for you will be 12:40 still. So we'll still meet at 12:40. So the idea is that we'll be breaking into groups. So anyone online will be dividing into 2 groups, and my colleague Delinda and I will be with you, so that we can have a bit of a conversation in just smaller groups. Everyone, of course, in presence in the room, you'll be all together to have a conversation. And the idea is to introduce yourselves if you don't know each other already, and to discuss a list of questions that I will show you in a moment. And then at 12:40, we'll come back all together, and we would ask that each group has identified maybe a note taker, not to take minutes, but really to just write down a few key takeaways that can then be shared with the group. So here is the list of questions that we have for you today, and this is a proposed list of questions. You can go beyond this, or you can see what other topics might be of interest for you today, but what we had proposed is to, yes, do a brief introduction of everyone, thinking about the national soil challenges. So what is the overall condition? Which are the challenges mentioned in the soil mission can you recognize in your region of Ireland? And looking at living lab opportunities, if you were to start a living lab today, where would it be? Which land type would be relevant? Who might be engaged? And what might be some of the potential obstacles standing in the way? So this is the list of questions. So for the groups that are, the group that is online, we will be using Miro for our conversation so that we can collaborate and add thoughts to these different questions. For everyone in the room, you can take some notes if you'd like. We just thought that for those online, it'd be a bit of an easier way to have conversations. But for anyone in presence, we'll leave it up to you to decide how you might want to take down some notes to be shared after the fact. So with that, we will put yes, thank you, Delinda, for putting in the chat box here the list of questions so that anyone in the room has in the presence are together in presence. You have the list of questions in the chat box here to reference to. Since once we break the room here in Zoom into two, I could leave the slide up, but I'm not sure if it's going to show. So we put the questions in the chat box for your reference, should you need it. And with that, we will be breaking the group into two, and we'll be reconvening in time for 12:40 local time, Dublin local time. Perfect. So let me open the breakout rooms here. One moment. There you go, making sure that Delinda and I are different rooms. Perfect, so we'll reconvene at 12:40. Thanks. Hello, everyone, welcome back. I hope you had some great conversations. I was seeing a lot of cursors just flying on the Miro board, which is always a good sign. So we wanted to use just a little bit of time here to reconvene and reflect a little bit and share some of the thoughts that were contributed in the different groups. So from my group, number one, we have our voluntold person, Tamai, who will be just sharing just a couple thoughts from the conversations that we had. And then Delinda, I'll turn it to you and whoever might be have been selected.
So do I go now then, yes?
Yes, please.
Okay, so we had a bit of a chit chat there about our backgrounds, introduce ourselves, and identify, I suppose, challenges. We try to relate them to our own regions and so forth. So there's all sorts of different things ranging from the biodiversity losses, nutrient deficiency in soils, carbon sequestration, pathways of nutrients to water, all sorts of things like that. A major thing is that we need to map and define our baselines in Ireland to know where is what and see what the needs are and how to address those. I suppose we talked about the various cropping systems, the disparity of the soils, and we finalized, I suppose, with the conclusion that we have to have an approach of caution into the new biologicals as fertilizers, because we don't want to end up in a situation where introducing new biologicals in an area might end up causing more trouble than good. I don't know if I captured everything, Isabel, kind of. This is what I remember.
Thanks.
More or less what we discussed.
Great.
Yes.
We just wanted to mention a couple of things. This is perfect. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
To you, Delinda.
Yes, so we actually we were lost in some questions, so we didn't really fulfill the Miro, because we were just discussing about some questions that were shared by the participants, like about the living labs, about the size of the living labs in Ireland, or thinking about really in Ireland how living labs should be should appear in some way, how we should be structured. And then we actually there was a comment of David Ellis that he was talking, and then well, the session finished about how this creating a living labs could really create a good opportunity for farmers, because in some way it was from his personal perspective. So I don't know if by chance, David, you want to finish your thought, because you were interrupted, and really sorry for this.
Well, that's very thoughtful of you, and I appreciate that. My point was that, and I'm speaking specifically in relation to commercial agriculture now, which does cover a significant portion of our our land mass and soils, is that without funding from any government sources at this point in time, there are a very significant number, admittedly it's a small cohort against the overall farming population, who are adopting very progressive farming practices based on biological farming principles and achieving results, significant nitrogen reduction without reductions in output, making homemade ferments, treating compost anaerobically with lactobacillus labs. These are all practices that have been around for a long period of time. So when it comes to the living labs, there is already in the country a lot of farmers. They may not be getting official recognition, and that actually is a moot point. But the issue is that they're there and the work is actually happening. So I believe we have a reasonable geographic spread as well, where farmers could be identified that are actually doing this work that's all focused on ultimately improved soil structure and function. That's it, really.
That's great. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing your thoughts. I know it's always a bit short, but it's good to hear from you and to get the creative juices flowing in terms of thinking through some of these questions. And we certainly hope that this is the first of many conversations that this group will have regarding some of these topics and thinking through participating into the soil mission calls. So with that, I will simply provide just a final brief conclusion to my part of the event today when it comes to the next steps and the support that the Neshoons project can provide us. So I trust that my screen should now be coming through. So yes, I just wanted to briefly mention some of the support to applicants activities that will be rolling out for you. Some of them are already available, some of them are upcoming. So of course, as of today, we have national engagement events, as I've mentioned before. So we're delivering them in 43 countries. There will be many more to come until the end of April, approximately. So, if you always wanted to join any other country's events, you could, if you wanted to, if you were interested. They're all posted on the Neshoons website. We also have matchmaking, which I will speak more about in a moment, at the national level. We have as well, if I can click through, there you go. We have fact sheets and e-learning materials coming up. So we are developing fact sheets for each of the 4 soil mission land use that I've referred to before. We also developing a Living Labs basics fact sheets that will all be posted online on the website. Hopefully very shortly, within the next week or so is what we're hoping to do. So more to come on that, and stay tuned and keep an eye on the website. There is also a help desk and that is being launched very soon, where you'll be able to reach out and ask more questions. As I've told my group earlier on in the engagement session, is that we're very much gathering your feedback and your questions so that we can reference it back not only in a frequently asked question list that will be posted on the website, so that you can have access to the official response to different types of questions, but also we're providing that feedback to the Soil Mission Secretariat, which can then use that information for the next round of calls that will be in 2024. So we always welcome your thoughts and comments. We have as well webinars on Living Lab methodology that I've mentioned before. We have coaching available, which I'll refer to in more detail in a moment. And we have thematic events and more webinars coming up, matchmaking at an international and thematic level. And just very briefly, in more detail and more specifically, so here we have the contact information, of course, of Dr. Ryan, who's hosting us today as well. So who is our official mentor for Ireland. So feel free to, Willie, I will put you up for availability when it comes to coaching for everyone, and reach out to your mentor. So to ask any questions or to think through ideas as well. We have matchmaking sessions. We've just recently launched our matchmaking tool, which is a platform that we have everyone subscribing to. You're able to search for different types of stakeholders, that you're able to make connections beyond your region, beyond your country. So we encourage everyone to go online and subscribe to the matchmaking tool, which will be open for the duration of the project. And then again, more information to come on the capacity building webinars and thematic events. Stay tuned, keep an eye on the website, and we also have a newsletter you can subscribe to on the websites. And this is just about the matchmaking platform. And I'll just leave this up here for you as you can make note of the ways to get in touch with Delinda and I, or with the Nashoons Project. We're on socials as well. So feel free to tweet at us, ping us, whatever it might be. I see a hand raised, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Just very briefly, I'm happy to hear that you will be able, to give some feedback, because overall I have to say at the moment, I'm really disillusioned and disappointed, with this call, because it's not cooperative, it's not collaborative, it's the same old, hyper competitive. There will only be 3, successful ones, and we know already who they will be. So what I'm interested in, if you know the actual scaling up, so since we are told there will be 100 of these in 2027, do you know what the rollout is then of these calls? Because this competitive nature is just it's really anti-productive for us. So
no, thank
thanks.
you. That's an interesting comment, since the way that it's been, and we will certainly take this back to communicate with the Soil Mission Secretariat, of course, but the way it's been, and I think I mentioned this in my breakout group, is that the way it's presented to us, and so that we can communicate with you, is we're really trying, they've emphasized the collaborative nature actually of the calls, in the way that, because they are cluster projects involving several living labs, the amount of total stakeholders that will be involved from different regions, from different member states or associated countries, is quite impressive. So it's seen as a way to push for collaboration and not competition. But that being said, I hear your concern, and we'll take this back and communicate that to within internally as well within the Nashoons Project, so that maybe as we're thinking through, we can identify, we can get more information and share that with the group. So I do thank you for that comment. Thank you. Okay, so just being mindful of time here, I do know that we had a bit of an all other business, but before I pass it back on to Dr. Ryan, I did want to say a big thank you to the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, of course, for hosting today's event. Very much appreciate all the support we've received so far, and of course to Dr. Daly for joining us today and presenting, and to all of you for sticking around till the end of today's event. We'll be recording. Of course, we have recorded today's event, so we'll be making sure to follow up with all of you to share additional information in the days to come. And in the meantime, as I've mentioned many times, feel free to reach out, ask questions, and provide comments. So thank you very, very much. And back over to you, Willie.
Thanks, Isabel. So just to give a brief update on some of the recent events within the Horizon and the Soil Mission Network, so in particular. So there's been loads of different webinars on recently, and some very informative ones. They can all be found on YouTube. Next slide, please, Isabel. There. And I suppose upcoming events are basically the launch of the mission manifesto, the Soil Mission Manifesto, which is going to be rolled out by the European Regions Research and Innovation Network sometime in mid-April. It's estimated at. In May, we have the newsletter for the soil mission. The first edition will be sent out between May and June. At the end of May and June, there's an EU Research and Innovation Conference. I'm not sure if you can register for that yet, but it's going to be open soon if it's not open already. The soil mission website hopefully to be operational by June, and there potentially will be a soil mission fair, which is still under construction, I suppose, as regards exactly what's going to happen. Will be sometime around November. And next slide, please, Isabel. I suppose just to remind everybody, the current 9 calls which are still open, and there's loads of opportunities there. We spent a lot of time today going through 8 and 9 as regards living labs, but there's plenty of other areas of expertise among the group here which fall into all the other calls. So there's plenty of information on the funding, the portal, funding portal website. So all the information is up to date on that, because there is minor changes to the various work programs on a regular basis. So it's just keep that in mind. Next slide, please, Isabel. And then any further information that's required, you'll find it all on the web. There's oceans and oceans of information, and all the different seminars are all published on YouTube as well, and on the Commission's website. But I suppose YouTube is very easy to find them through a search function there. Just type in soil mission, you'll get an array of stuff. Next slide, please, Isabel. And then there's the funding and tenders portal. Just to remind everybody, all the information is up to date on that. Next slide, please, Isabel. And there's YouTube as well. Next slide, please, Isabel. And that's me. Thank you, everybody.
Isabel, I might just come in there as well with a few concluding remarks. So just like on that last slide of Willie's there, that's the YouTube video from the event that was held in January, I think, which, you know, the slides were quite good, but actually the questions session was, I thought, very useful. It answered a lot of the most common questions that come up around living labs. So if you haven't watched that back, that's a good one. And also, I think it was a week or 2 ago, the EU Soil Health Dashboard was launched. Very useful tool, I must say. I was surprised at the level of detail it goes down into at a national level in identifying a lot of the soil challenges. And if you thought that our soils weren't so bad in this country, have a look at that and you realize that we have a huge range of physical, chemical and biological challenges with our soils. In terms of where we go now, I mean, I think we're at a fairly important point in the year in terms of those September deadlines. So, I mean, I'd be interested in hearing people's views on when they think we should meet again and in what format. I mean, I think initially we said we might meet on a quarterly basis, but that's pushing it out to June, and I think time slips on in the meantime. So, you know, we're kind of keen to hear people's views. I mean, should we organise more regular meetings between now and the summer break in order to advance some more thoughts on how people could work together to put some applications into these calls, or should we leverage the matchmaking facility that Nashoons have highlighted today that they offer? Should we organise, you know, a dedicated half-day workshop session to go into the issues that we discussed at a very superficial level today, to discuss those in more detail? Or, you know, is there anything more we can do? Is there another format we can take here to help people to put proposals together? Acknowledging Olaf's point that this is very competitive, no doubt. I mean, it is quite, you know, it is disappointing to see the number of projects that will be funded, given the level of interest, the huge amount of work that goes into pulling these proposals together and pulling the consortia together. Having said that, I can tell you it will be very, very disappointing from our perspective in the department, and I know from the minister's perspective, if there isn't some level of interest in applications going into these calls. So, we're keen to do everything we can to help people in that regard. So interested to hear people's views. I mean, if people don't have thoughts, we might go away and think about it ourselves without giving you an indication at the moment of when we will next meet. I think we probably need to have a bit of a reflection ourselves on that. I'm uncomfortable with the idea of leaving our next meeting to June, because I think we're just going to waste a couple of months. So I think we may end up looking to organize something sooner than that, much sooner than that, maybe within the next 3 to 4 weeks, and maybe do it as a workshop style session. Ian?
Thanks, Carl. Just a reflection. First of all, happy to meet more frequently. I think from today's meeting, it's clear. I mean, the complexity of the challenge here is enormous, and it's the same across the other missions. And I think the soil mission, in many ways, is further on. So I think there's a challenge to within, and with all respect to the Commission, there is still a degree of confusion. There is still a degree of differentiation across different missions and so forth. And so there's different drivers that are pushing us in, and as you say, Carl, probably the most pressing one is the deadline for calls at the in September. So I think happy to meet more frequently. I think there is still more discussion around how we deal with the level of complexity that we're facing, and the time scale, the contracted time scales that we're facing. Yeah, I think other than that, just to, as I say, to acknowledge and to feed back to the Commission that this is a very challenging process for member states. Yeah, we're at a fairly advanced point in terms of the calls being open, and there's still fairly basic information that we're grappling to get our heads around. So given that context, as I say, very happy to meet more often and very happy to input as much as we can in order to make sure that we do get some applications in by September.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Ian. And I think somebody agreed that we should meet sooner. And look, I'm conscious as well, like, we put a fairly big effort into developing this group and the composition of the group. And I think we have really strong range of expertise in the group. Even Helena, that's here in the room with me, she's already, in a way, gone through this process of bringing together people in a living lab, and can offer, I think, a lot of experience and insight, from that project in Limerick to us. So, yeah, my inclination is that we will meet within the next few weeks again, and I think we might do it in a slightly different format in order to, facilitate better discussion and engagement. And look, I know there's a lot of, even nationally, there's competition, so it would be useful for us to know, if you are working with people already on putting together an application or a consortium, if you like, it would be helpful to let Willie know in confidence. I mean, I know there can be, as I said, competition between people and organizations, so we won't divulge it to anybody, but it would be useful for us to know what people are working on in the background. So yeah, I think that's even just a comment there for the September deadline. Bids would need to start in April. I agree. Time is going to slip on very fast. So look, we'll come back to you within the next week with a date for a next meeting, but you can expect it to be maybe towards late April. Okay, thanks everybody. Isabel, I don't know if you have any last words to say, but certainly from my perspective, I want to thank everyone for making the effort to participate today, and let's keep the conversation going.
Thanks very much, and I echo all of that. So nothing further to add on my end, just another big thank you to everyone, and we hope to remain in touch, and feel free to contact us if you have any further questions or comments. Thank you all so very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your
Thank
day.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.